Good afternoon. I'm Mahan Mirza, teaching professor at the Keough School and executive director of its Ansari Institute. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, I was driving from New York City to New Haven to begin a doctoral program in Islamic studies. Driving across Throgs Neck Bridge, the Twin Towers were visible, ablaze like candles on the horizon. They were still standing when we crossed. The seminar I was attending that morning was on Islamic rationalism and its influence on Europe. All who witnessed 9/11 carry vivid memories of an attack that has shaped the climate of global conflict ever since. The undergraduates starting college today were yet to be born. 2 decades later, we gather to reflect on that tragic day. This is a 3-part series. Today's event is part 1. Please join us for part 2 on October 6th with a keynote by Elizabeth Hurd and respondents Atalia Omer and Ray Offenheiser. And also join us for part 3 on November 3rd with a keynote by Stephen Wald and respondent Nazia Kazi. We'd like to recognize the many sponsors of this series at the Keough School of Global Affairs: the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, along with the Keough Institute for International Studies, Clough Center for Civil and Human Rights, the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, and the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Special thanks to David Courtwright and the Global Policy Initiative for leading this school-wide collaboration. After the keynote, today's 3 panelists will speak in this order: Perrin Gurel, Associate Professor of American Studies at Notre Dame; Jamila Afghani, founder and executive director of Noor Educational and Capacity Development Organization and executive member of the Afghan Women's Network; and Ibrahim Musa, Mirza Family Professor of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies in the Keough School. And Jamila Afghani will be joining us online. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation, both here in person and to our online audience. Together, there are over 300 people joining us from near and far. And now, please welcome the Dean of the Keough School, Scott Appleby, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Mahan, and welcome to everyone who's here, both here in the room and online joining us. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today. Andrew J. Bacevich is a historian specializing in international relations, security studies, and American military history. Professor Emeritus of International Relations and History at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies, he currently serves as president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is one of the most innovative and important new think tanks in Washington, D.C. Bacevich is a 1969 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, where he later taught history. He received a PhD in U.S. diplomatic history from Princeton. Bacevich commanded troops in Vietnam in 1970 and 1971 and ended his 23-year military career in 1992, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. His son, Andrew John Bacevich, also an Army officer, died fighting in the Iraq War in May 2007. Dr. Bacevich has written eloquently and trenchantly of the folly of America's imperial ambition and what he calls the recurring misuse of military power. He has a prolific pen or keyboard and is the author of more than a dozen books, including his latest, After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed, which came out this year. He won the 2014 American Book Award for Breach of Trust how Americans failed their soldiers and their country. Bacevich has described himself as a Catholic conservative. He has spoken of the need for a left-right coalition to prevent the kind of needless wars and unachievable nation-building mission, such as the 20-year mission, which just ended in Afghanistan. And he was a visiting fellow at the Kroc Institute a few years ago. We were delighted to be in his company and form friendship with him. And he was here just as we were beginning to talk about a global affairs school at Notre Dame. So really, really thrilled to welcome him back to campus now that the Keough School is up and running. There could be no more appropriate occasion for his return to Notre Dame than to help us understand and learn lessons from the US policy responses to the 9/11 attacks. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Bacevich.
Well, I thank Dean Appleby for that generous introduction. It's a thrill to be here. I got to tell you, I love this institution. And I know you students know how lucky you are to be here. It is just one of the wonderful places in our country, maybe one of the wonderful places on the planet. So I'm going to talk for, I hope, not more than 10 minutes so that my colleagues have a chance to speak. And when we get to the end of our remarks, there's going to be time for Q&A. So let me dive right in, and I'll begin with an assertion. The existing approach to basic US policy dating from the end of the Cold War is no longer germane. Events have exposed our prevailing assumptions about national security as false. Two such assumptions stand out. First, post-Cold War ideological expectations of the universal triumph of neoliberalism and or globalization and or democracy, those expectations have turned out to be illusory. Second, when put to the test, so too have assumptions about US military supremacy that was supposed to back up the ideological claims that came out of the end of the Cold War. Frankly, the outcome of the Afghanistan war is only the latest event in a series of events that demolishes those assumptions. Further complicating the problem of devising an alternative approach to US policy are three facts. I'll call them facts. You may not agree. The first fact is that information technology is having a transformative effect on every aspect of human existence. The effects are both positive and negative. I told my colleagues when we were chatting beforehand, I don't happen to own a cell phone because I think most of those effects are negative, but I think mine is a minority view. Second complicating problem is the global redistribution of power. It's radically changing with the rise of China, the preeminent, but by no means the only example of this shift of the distribution of power. Third, we here in the United States find ourselves enmeshed in a massive domestic crisis that may well prove to be, I think will prove to be protracted. Nominally, that crisis centers on race, gender, and sexuality, but in my judgment, in actuality, it expresses anger at unfulfilled promises of what we refer to as the American way of life. It is a crisis of culture with prevailing notions, the notions I grew up with, prevailing notions of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness having proven somehow inadequate. That inadequacy finds expression in anger, most notably, but not exclusively, among right-leaning whites who feel increasingly dispossessed. One essential, but not sufficient, response to the current crisis will be to adopt a radically different national security paradigm. The existing paradigm, which emerged at the end of World War II, focuses on threats out there, in Europe, in East Asia, in the Middle East. And that prevailing paradigm emphasizes amassing and using military power as the essential response to those threats. The new paradigm should prioritize threats that endanger Americans where they live. That's the key phrase. Endanger Americans where they live. That is to say, not out there, but back here. What are those threats? You know them. They include pandemics, such as COVID-19, the climate crisis, manifested in fires and flood, droughts, and hurricanes, pervasive environmental degradation. We could point to many examples. The one that for some reason bothers me the most is knowing that every time I eat fish, I'm also consuming microplastics. Porous borders that facilitate trafficking in drugs, guns, and human beings, thereby undermining the rule of law. Cyber intrusiveness, which bids fair to end privacy with the emergence of a comprehensive surveillance regime, which we haven't, I think, even begun to come to terms with. The erosion of confidence in basic government institutions. Certainly, we saw this during and as a consequence of the Trump era. For example, the erosion of confidence in the Congress and the Supreme Court. Rampant political dishonesty, which promotes cynicism. Let's call it the Fox News effect. And finally, maybe most importantly, the disuniting of American society stemming from multiple factors, but above all from unresolved issues regarding race. A new national security paradigm will not only respond to existing and emerging threats, the things I just ticked off, but will also create space for the country to heal itself and reunify. In other words, the national security threat needs to focus above all on our domestic internal needs. The establishment's preferred response to the present moment, premised on the return of great power rivalry, is, in my judgment, unlikely to work. Among other things, the world of the 1930s and 1940s or 1950s and 1960s is gone for good. As an aside, the white male, and we must admit, mostly Protestant, policy elites of that era, of the post-war era, people like George Marshall, Dean Acheson, George Kennan, Paul Nitze, they, by and large, accurately grasped the essential problems facing the United States at the end of World War II. And they formulated a reasonably enlightened response that included initiatives such as the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO, and so on. Reasonably enlightened, not perfect by any means. But today, although that formula still carries great weight in Washington, every time somebody raises the question of NATO, we hear about the imperative of preserving it. Today, that formula has not only outlived its usefulness, in my judgment, it has become counterproductive. While today's policy elite may score higher on the diversity scale, I see little reason to expect comparable creativity comparable to what we got from the post-war generation. The problem is not simply that the blob, as it's called, is brain dead, although it is indeed brain dead. The problem is that the United States is not the nation that it was when it faced off first against right-wing and then against left-wing totalitarianism. For evidence, look no further than the outcome of the Afghanistan war, a multi-dimensional failure of epic proportions. The United States spent 20 years. One of my colleagues told me that the estimated monetary cost is now up to, what, $8 trillion? The United States spent 20 years attempting to, 1, create a legitimate and viable Afghan nation state, 2, defeat the Taliban, and 3, bring into existence Afghan security forces with the capacity and determination to defend the nation. We failed on all counts. With the Biden administration's mismanaged final drawdown of US troops merely punctuating that failure. The real story here is not what happened over the past couple of weeks. The real story here is what happened over the past 20 years. So my premise is Afghanistan should serve as a wake-up call. We have had others that we have chosen to ignore. We can no longer afford to do so. Going forward, a proper approach to national security will recognize that keeping Americans safe where they live must shape basic policy. That's not the only priority, but it's the priority that should come first. The point is not to advocate isolationism, not to advocate disarmament, not to advocate pacifism. Rather, the point is to prioritize threats that actually matter in the here and now. The United States will always require adequate military forces to defend vital US interests. But Americans have interests very much in need of attention where military power offers little of relevance. So the question, it seems to me, is where are the Marshalls, Atchisons, and Kennons of the present generation who will replicate the achievement of those who some 70 years ago renewed American statecraft in a time of need? We await their appearance. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to structure my comments around two provocative quotes. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, awesome. The first one comes from the paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces, and Resources for a New Century, produced by the neoconservative think tank Project for a New American Century in 1997. This think tank is, of course, notorious, as 10 out of its 12 members, including Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, went on to serve in the George W. Bush administration and played key roles in determining the so-called Bush Doctrine of preemptive and unilateral military action. This document was built on the argument that the post-Cold War United States, quote, should seek to preserve and extend its position of global leadership by maintaining the preeminence of US military forces, unquote. Far from glossy-eyed, it acknowledged that such a plan would be opposed both by US allies and the world community, as well as by the people of the United States. Quote, a transformation strategy that solely pursued capabilities for projecting force from the United States, for example, and sacrifice forward basing and presence would be at odds with larger American policy goals and would trouble American allies. Further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is unlikely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Okay, now, I know that this final sentence has fueled multiple theories of conspiracy regarding 9/11. Yet the cliche that we should believe people when they tell us what and who they are rings true here. There is no doubt that the George W. Bush and Dick Cheney administration attempted to utilize 9/11 exactly as a new Pearl Harbor, rushing through an overly broad authorization for the use of military force through Congress, which depicted the entire world as the proper sphere of US military might in theory and targeted non-white countries rich in resources in reality. It also helped the administration initiate a series of crackdowns on civil liberties, including the USA Patriot Act and the selective registration and deportation of Arabs and Muslims across the United States. These laws, as multiple scholars have demonstrated, undid the administration's flowery rhetoric about not all Muslims and gave sanction to hate crimes against anyone perceived to be Muslim and or Arab. Really, the title, Project for a New American Century, tells it all. This inability to let go of Cold War fantasy, referring to a selective narrative of World War II and its aftermath, is precisely the subject of Bacevich's book, After the Apocalypse, and the focus of his talk today. In that book, which I highly recommend, by the way, Bacevich highlights how interventionism thrives on, quote, the way we have packaged the past, unquote, and demonstrates how the bipartisan policy elite have continued to hold on to American exceptionalism, depicting the United States as an indispensable nation that acts as a force of good across the world as called onto by Providence. While these claims have been tempered somewhat by the disastrous outcomes of America's latest adventures in West and South Central Asia, they remain with us in the words of pundits who worry about the effects of a reduced US military presence across the world. The phrase, quote, the space left by the United States will be filled by blank, sometimes Iran, China, Russia, etc., makes it clear that even liberals, or maybe especially liberals, continue to believe that spaces far, far across the Atlantic somehow belong to the United States by right. And the United States, if not perfectly good, is somehow better. This delusion is maintained by a bizarre Cold War nostalgia that simply refuses to go away. By the way, our Notre Dame colleague, Eugene Goltz, has written an excellent paper critiquing this view about the spaces being filled by regional or global adversaries that's the Quincy paper number 7. Every day, we hear policymakers admonishing some nation state, mostly Iran, to, quote, act like a normal state, unquote. Bacevich reminds us that the United States itself does nothing of the sort, and the policy elite's reluctance to let go of their imperial addiction to exceptionalism endangers not just the world, but also Americans. The Americans the US empire punishes most mightily, of course, are communities of color, the indigenous, the poor, immigrants, and women and children, and anyone who finds themselves at the intersection of these social structures. Thus, my second provocative quote, which comes from the 2016 platform for the Movement for Black Lives. Quote, America is an empire that uses war to expand territory and power. American wars are unjust, destructive to Black communities globally, and do not keep Black people safe locally. The military-industrial complex offers massive profits to private corporations from the death of our global diaspora by handing out massive government contracts to expand US military presence across the globe, while resources for domestic infrastructure and social programs to meet the needs of Black people and working class communities within the United States diminishes, unquote. And that's from the 2016 platform of the Movement for Black Lives. I find that this quote coheres with Bacevich's argument regarding where they live, although the racial underpinnings of empire were not emphasized in what he shared with us today. Indeed, in After the Apocalypse, Bacevich notes that intellectuals of color have often been at the forefront of speaking out against empire. We may add that their critique has aptly focused on the intersections of capitalism, racism, and militarism that underline expansionism and interventionism. Today's movements for justice are no exception, although our interpretations of them tend to be parochial and patronizing when not outright paranoid, whereas our interpretations of past movements tend to be rosy and overly idealized. So ironically, I find that Bacevich himself indulged in a bit of Cold War nostalgia here when he asked, where are the Marshalls, Atchisons, and Kennons of the present generation who will replicate the achievement of those who 70-some years ago renewed American staff in a time of need, and claimed, quote, while today's policy elite may score higher on the diversity scale, I see little reason to expect comparable creativity, unquote. So I was hoping, if we have time at the end, whether he could explain that comment a bit further and also discuss whether it may not be the policy elite at all, but the people's movements that show the way. After all, is there any way US policy elites, no matter their background, can be anything other than handmaidens to empire? Is the applied field of foreign relations even capable of promoting anything outside the frame of American exceptionalism, nationalism, and expansionism, bound as it is to serve a state largely under the control of the military-industrial complex? Thank you. Jamila is next.
Thank you. Thank you, both fellows, for your wonderful speech. My focus will be on Afghanistan. I'm representing Afghanistan in this platform to tell you that in the past 20 years of war contribution, we are standing right now. You're celebrating the 20th anniversary of 9/11, but unfortunately, we Afghan are at the same point today when we were 20 years back. The US NATO forces started fighting against Taliban to demolish Taliban and to establish a government, an inclusive government. But today, we are at the verge of collapse with all that investment of money and energy and resources we had. You might be celebrating 20 anniversary of end of the war, but for Afghan, it is not ended war. It is a start of another misery, a chapter of another misery for our nation, for our people. You had your own perception, your own understanding and analysis about why US was failed in Afghanistan. Let me tell you as an Afghan that why US failed in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country, a tribal country with multi-layer problems and issues. The very first basic mistake international community and US made, it was about the Bonn Conference, that they wanted to exclude Taliban from the Bonn Conference, and they invested much more in their power, in their powerful supremacy to fight and to demolish Taliban. But it was proven wrong. Afghanistan, from many, many centuries, are in war. And this is the title that mostly your politician is giving to us. And it is because Afghanistan is a tribal country where when one of the tribal community excluded, then the rest of the community, tribal leaders stand against that. And animosity starts and the fighting is going on. Another big mistake that the international community did, it was to bring a government according to their own choice, not according to the choices of people. We experienced an immature democracy in Afghanistan. People were not ready for such a democracy in Afghanistan. Where every time, 4 times our elections were failed. Every time we brought those people who were not selected by people to rule us. And what was ended? One day before the takeover of Taliban Kabul, President Ghani had a wonderful speech, and he was talking to sacrifice himself and his life for the sake of people. On 15 August, I was in the airport. I was traveling to Turkey. I was holding my boarding pass, waiting for the plane. Just all the politicians rushed towards the airport. Parliamentarians, ministers, deputy ministers, and they occupied the plane forcefully. And then the airline announced another 2 flights to take place. So we were waiting to get a seat in the next flight. But after a while, we heard a rumor that Taliban is going to attack the airport. So I assumed that because all the politicians were in the airport, so I was not feeling safe. Then I had to leave the airport with my children. When we came out of the airport, it was a very shocking moment for me. Just within 2-3 hours, everything collapsed. Just I saw the soldier cape and uniform was lying on the ground beside their gun. And there was no soldier, no guard, no security there. Just within 2-3 hours, everything was collapsed. And the area from where I came to my home, from the airport to my home, it is not a distance of 10 minutes. So just you could see that everything was finished. The city was a dead city. There was no living being on the street, and everybody was hiding themselves at their homes. One of the call of international community was to help Afghanistan 20 years to support women of Afghanistan. But they left us behind without noticing what's going to happen in Afghanistan. Today, Abbas Stanexai has announced that in 2 days, Taliban will announce their government. And he openly said that there will be no women minister in the cabinet. At the moment, most of the girls up to class 6 are allowed to go to the school. And rest of the elder generation are not allowed to go to school. All the Taliban are calling that they will allow everybody to go to the system and to continue their work, but there is no guarantee for us. Just look at the biggest mismanagement evacuation process that we underwent. I'm right now in Norway. I was planning to never leave my country, but this is fourth time in 45 years of my age that I'm leaving my country, and I'm taking refuge in another country. This was a disaster. This is a disaster on us, on our life. You have spent huge sum of money in Afghanistan with such a indignified, with such a mismanaged evacuation. Just US and NATO's are playing with their numbers, that how many numbers they have evacuated. But you know, reality on the ground, that many civil society, HRDs still, they are stuck in Afghanistan. They do not find the way to get out of Afghanistan. Or if from the other side, all elites are getting out of Afghanistan, what will happen to Afghanistan? This is not a wrong or mismanagement in the part of USA and NATO, but you have been played with our life, with our future, with our past and with our today. And today I again see through the news as I'm following that again, now international community is trying to not give legitimacy to Taliban's government. Whatever, they are victorious. Now they have power in their hand. And the 36 million people, innocent people, are in the verge of collapse. The systems which we built it into 20 years now in the verge of collapse. International community and US must closely watch Taliban to announce their government as soon as it is possible to start the functioning. Otherwise, people are not having even money for their daily cost. The banks are closed, the schools are closed, the systems are closed, and there is nothing to do, and people are totally disappointed. I hope the international community will also listen to people of Afghanistan, to people of other countries that they have suffered because of the wrong management of US and NATO, supremacy for their own power, for their own benefit, which has costed us our life and our future and future of our children. I'm really sorry that I don't have a written speech because I lost during evacuation everything, even my computer. Just we could survive with my family, with my children. And I'm sorry for this emotional speech because this is the reality of our life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to speak here. And thank you, Jamila, for sharing with us the tragedy that is unfolding in Afghanistan. If I don't get through all my comments, I at least want to highlight 4 points. The issue of accountability, the question of history, how to listen, and an outside chance that we might be able to think. What happened on September 11, 2001 were crimes against innocent civilians in New York, Washington, and those who perished in the fields of Pennsylvania. What happened in its wake in Afghanistan and Iraq were unjustified and unmitigated acts of aggression and occupation by the United States and its European allies against 2 entire countries, against world opinion. We know our US death tolls, but we guesstimate the civilian deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq. Anyone who disagrees with my claim that these were unjustified wars obviously might wish to revise his or her position because they, as our guest speaker, Andrew Bacevich, would say, they subscribe to American exceptionalism. And I strongly recommend this book, although I'm not through it, but I did get Andy's advanced comments for today. It is American exceptionalism that brought us 9/11. We thought we could intervene in global events, side with occupation, perform acts of violence around the world without any consequences. 9/11 were the crimes by a ragtag army of non-state actors, such as Al-Qaeda, who took refuge in the Hindu Kush Mountains, and then they were elevated to global heroes. The truth is that most right-thinking people around the world did not view them as heroes, but neither did they buy into American exceptionalism. The fallen soldiers of the war in Afghanistan, followed by the even more craven invasion of Iraq, these soldiers did their duty to their country. Our guest speaker himself has a military background and is a Gold Star father. I have very little to say in this regard except respect for you, Dr. Bacevich, for the sacrifice and the courage you display in your writings. The question today is this: did America do its duty and hold its politicians accountable for spending the blood and treasure on wars of choice that did not change the world an iota? To the contrary, a good section of America's political class adopted a more brazen, cynical attitude and manipulated the public, aided and abetted by ratings-chasing media. And I do not only mean Fox News. CNN is no better, and neither is the New York Times innocent. 2 decades later, a significant segment of the American public is sufficiently cynical, ready to violently damage the institutions of democracy, as well as harm representatives of the Republic, as we witnessed on January 6, 2021. And so, Andrew, my question to you is, how do you address the question of accountability? You have given us a plan of what the facts are on the ground, but the question is, how do we form this new paradigm without accountability? If you think January 6, 2021 was madness, then I ask you to think again. I'm asking the audience. Recall the madness that was first unleashed on a frightened and unwitting American public in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Then that madness spread to Afghanistan, then to Iraq, and only 2 decades later did it boomerang on Washington on January 6. It took one demagogue to take the political demagoguery of more than 2 decades and more to new levels and manipulate the emotions of an uncritical public and mobilize them to violence. America and Americans did not like to hear from his prophetic voices after 9/11, people like Representative Barbara Lee from California, Amiri Baraka, poet laureate of New Jersey, and Reverend Jeremiah Wright, a minister in Chicago. What did all these people have in common? They were Black Americans, and their experience and wisdom counted for nothing. Black and brown people's experiences of violence and politics still centuries later count for nothing, nor does it 20 years later after 9/11. And oh yes, I did not tell you that the political class in this country are also enemies of history. Recall the hostility Reverend Jeremiah Wright faced in 2008 when an election season remembered he quoted Malcolm X's words that the chickens are coming home to roost as a prompt reminder of the causes of 9/11. Remember Representative Barbara Lee, who refused to give President George W. Bush the broad authorization he demanded to carry out the war in Afghanistan. Then Senator Joe Biden, now President, Senator Bernie Sanders, both voted for the broad authorization of war, that same authorization that was used to justify the war in Iraq. Representative John Lewis, a proponent of nonviolence, voted in favor of the war and said he immediately regretted it. As a historian, I want to share with you Barbara Lee's words. She said, on the 14th of September, in Congress, however difficult this vote may be, some of us must urge the use of restraint. Our country is in a state of mourning. Some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause, just for a minute, and think through the implications of our actions today so that this does not spiral out of control. So that this does not spiral out of control. This is courage, a woman's courage. This is no after-the-fact justification. Barbara Lee warned us 3 days after 9/11 that we should pause so that this does not spiral out of control. She warned us 23 days before the war in Afghanistan that started on 7 October 2001 and ended on 15 August 2021 when the Taliban took control of Kabul, or at midnight on 30th of August when the last US soldier left the battlefield. Barbara Lee was called a terrorist, a traitor, and accused of conduct close to treasonous. The House vote was 420-1. The Senate was 98-0 in favor of war. If there's one thing I have learned after living in America for 23 years and a citizen for 13 years, it is the unshakable metaphysical belief on the part of some Americans in destiny. For that reason, many believe America is God's gift to humanity as a force for good, and therefore America is great. I hope we unlearn this unhelpful dogma and begin to believe that there is good in others too. With pathological innocence comes another pathology: immunity from any kind of accountability. And while Jamila has reminded us about America's accountability, I also asked this question of Afghans: what is their accountability? In my life, from age 24, I've been raising funds for Afghanistan in the jihad against the Soviets. For the last 20 years or more, I've been paying taxes for a war in Afghanistan. What do the Afghan people want? And what did the Afghan people do when the Americans came there? And yes, why didn't we hear all these voices about the corruption and all the destruction that was happening with the collusion of Afghans? And what is Afghanistan's accountability going to be? On the global stage, the US projects military invincibility even when a sandaled and tunic-wearing ragtag Taliban soldiers can outweight, outmaneuver, and outlast the best equipped infantry and air power in human history. What good is the best army when we cannot win wars? The answer is simple. Wars are always unwinnable. You might have battlefield victors and losers, but most soldiers will tell you there are no winners. America knows that well after Vietnam and after the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. There are no winners. Some 20 years ago, a new resident of America shared the following words with an august audience of parents and graduates on June 16, 2001 at Stanford University. In the audience was Senator Clinton, former President Bill Clinton, and their daughter Chelsea Clinton, among others. The new resident said, I quote, "In different parts of the world," this is 2001, "in different parts of the world, there is great outrage at the double standards in world politics and economics. As more people's lives are affected by the disproportionate distribution of the world's resources, as well as the inequity of justice in international politics, all of us are exposed to extreme dangers on a daily basis. Even those of us who think we are safe and secure from the anger of the disgruntled and teeming millions can no longer be safe in our own homes and lands. We sleep uneasy if people are hungry and angry, even if they are continents away." End of quote. This insight required no foreign policy credentials, no advanced degree in peace studies. These were my words as a scholar of religion, that I shared in my baccalaureate address. All he needed to do is to hear what the world was saying and to think. Of course, never in my wildest imagination could I contemplate the scale and brutality of the criminal acts of 9/11 and its aftermath. The crucial lesson here is the imperative for thinking anew. Thinking and knowledge must once again assume its place as a moral imperative for all people, especially Americans. A powerful reminder for this comes from the work of the emigre German Jewish political philosopher Hannah Arendt. Arendt is famous for illuminating the banality of evil. Arendt used this phrase to capture the facile, superficial defense of Nazis and their sympathizers when they said, "Oh, we were just performing our patriotic duty." As she struggled to make sense of the evil committed by her compatriots in Germany that resulted in the near extermination of European Jews, Arendt made an even more insightful remark. What startled her most, she recalled, was the total absence of thinking in the accounts of such prominent Nazis as Adolf Eichmann, whom she observed on trial in Jerusalem. And we should ask this question: what is the total absence of thinking on our part, our politicians, our ruling classes, as well as our citizenry? Arendt's introspection after the trial is both haunting and edifying. Arendt wrestled with the question of whether thinking as such, the habit of examining and reflecting, could alone prevent evil. Yes, thinking can disrupt our existing habits of thought, she's conceded. And it can lead us to discover new ways of questioning. But the wind of thought, Arendt's way of describing the harvest of thinking, was not knowledge per se. Thinking should result in moral reasoning that equips us with the ability to tell right from wrong, beautiful from ugly. The conviction to declare this is wrong or this is beautiful involves a certain way of thinking. Today, most of us need to wear this piece of wisdom as a talisman around our necks. Contemporary America and its political and religious traditions are hurtling into incoherence. I thank you.
Thank you to our speakers. We have some time for questions. Audience, yes?
May I respond?
Oh, yes, sure.
I'm asking to respond only because we had some questions posed. And the first one was the issue of Cold War nostalgia. And I apologize to you if my remarks suggested that I'm nostalgic for the Cold War. In an attempt to clarify, what I was trying to say is that policymakers at the outset of the Cold War, by and large, underline that, by and large, not totally, not completely, I believe, had a realistic understanding of the threats confronting the United States at that point in time, and therefore, by and large, not perfectly, they pursued a course of policy that tended to respond to those requirements and tended to preserve the then existing global primacy enjoyed by the United States. I understand there was a nuclear arms race. I understand Vietnam. I understand the CIA's reckless interventionism. But by and large, it seemed to me they served the country well. Whereas today, at least in my judgment, I don't see that realistic appraisal of the situation that the country is actually facing, and therefore a willingness to define a new national security paradigm. And it seems to me that is the challenge that faces the current generation. Second issue is how do I address the issue of accountability? That is a great question to which I have no answer. But let me tell you an anecdote. In the second term of, I've only met one president in my entire life, and that was Barack Obama. In his second term, I got an email from Ben Rhodes. Some of you remember he was the Deputy National Security Advisor, said, "Dear Professor Bacevich, the president would like to have lunch with you. Would you come down?" It took me 3 days actually to believe it was genuine. It was genuine. I went down, had a one-on-one experience of a lifetime. luncheon with the president in this little room off the Oval Office. Of course, I went with my little 3x5 card of points I wanted to make. And one of the things I said to him was, sir, relates to accountability. We need to have a 9/11 commission that will address post 9/11 US policy. We need to have a objective, comprehensive inquiry into how and why we went so badly wrong. And I had a couple other suggestions. To each one of them, the president, who is perhaps the most impressive human being I've ever met, to each and every one, he basically said, well, thank you very much. Let me explain to you why I can't do that. Disappointing, but I think reflecting the difficulty of bringing about, of asking first order questions when you're in that policy arena. So yeah, we still need a 9/11 type commission, not for Afghanistan uniquely, but to take stock of the failures of national security policy that, to my mind, certainly go back to the beginning of the post-Cold War era, if not before. And then you use the phrase, the inequitable, I think you used it, inequitable distribution of wealth and privilege. That's the object of the exercise. There's a wonderful quote, which I cannot give you verbatim, a document that George Kennan wrote when he was in the State Department in 1948, in which he noted that the United States at that point had 6% of the world's population and well over 50% of the world's wealth. And Kennan said at that point, the purpose of US policy is to perpetuate that circumstance. And I would argue that has been the overarching theme of US policy ever since. And I would also argue, sadly, by and large, that's what the American people want. They want to perpetuate the privileges that we have enjoyed, obviously not uniformly shared by any means, but nonetheless, the privileges that we have enjoyed as a nation relative to many other nations, such as Afghanistan. I would argue that circumstances have now changed so radically. The share of US global wealth is now, I think, less than 30%. That arrangement, the one that Kennan pointed to, is unsustainable. But there will be no change in policy until the American people recognize that the arrangement is unsustainable, and therefore are willing to listen to push, to prod policymakers in Washington to come to a different course. Thank you.
We can allow for questions, or would any of you like to respond to the response? Question. All right. I just request people who are sitting on this side, if you just go outside and come around this way, and everyone over here to line up. We're going to take questions from the podium for the benefit of the online audience. So if you have a question, please come around. And while you're doing that, I'll ask the first question. Actually, there's two questions that have come in from online, and I'll pair them together. The questions are, what should the US have done after 9/11? If not military action, then what? And the second question is, what about the threat of ISIS-K? And I'll add to that, if not drone strikes, then what? Anybody who'd like to take it?
Andy is a military man.
Well, not anymore. But I'll take a shot at the response to 9/11. And this is, I guess it's me talking in 2021, but there were voices in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 that made this argument, that the proper response is not war. Certainly the proper response is not to undertake a global war. Certainly, the proper response is not to undertake a war against the so-called axis of evil, which consisted of 3 countries, none of which were actually involved in 9/11. So what was the proper course? The proper course was to see that heinous act as a criminal act undertaken by a criminal conspiracy with international reach. How do you respond to a criminal conspiracy on that scale? You organize an international police response. Now, the police response would not be men and women in blue uniforms in, downtown South Bend. It would involve the careful collaboration of international intelligence agencies and, yes, probably special operations forces. Again, an international collaborative effort that would root out and destroy the conspiracy. That would have involved violence, but the violence would not be advertised as a war. The scope would have been much more limited. The violence would have been more confined, and it would not have allowed for the kind of vast claims by the Project for the New American Century that imagined that by overthrowing regimes in far-off countries, that we were suddenly going to introduce liberal democracy. That, to me, was the alternate strategy. But again, of course, in the immediate wake of 9/11, the war drums were beating. A little advertisement for the Quincy Institute. We gave Representative Barbara Lee our first John Quincy Adams Award last December, recognizing the extraordinary courage and insight that she demonstrated by voting against the first AUMF. But the fact that she alone voted against that resolution tells you a lot about the mood of the country and the mood in Washington at that particular moment. We were aching for war. We got war. We still have war. And we certainly haven't effectively addressed the security problems that manifested themselves 20 years ago.
And what these wars have done has also made us tear up the rule of law on a global basis. Drone wars, and again, 2 days ago, trying to take out alleged ISIS-K individuals and so on. At least right now, the information is that 10 innocent Afghans, 7 of them kids, were killed. So I think that these wars have not served us well. And ISIS-K, I think ISIS-K and the Taliban are going to have it out amongst themselves. And if not, maybe this is just a ruse. I don't take everything the Taliban says on face value. One has to be critical of what they say. But nevertheless, they are now the de facto rulers, and they will soon learn what it is to govern, and whether it's and the Afghan people must decide. For 100 years in the 20th century, they had 2 constitutional monarchies. Both were turned over in Afghanistan. There were socialist governments at various stages. If in 1924, King Amanullah's constitutional provisions and rules were implemented that never were, Afghanistan would have been the first country in the world where women would have had the vote. But it didn't work. It didn't work out. Didn't follow through. He was toppled in 1929. So I think we need to, we went to Afghanistan with no one speaking Pashto or any of the local languages. And therefore we have tens of thousands of translators that became the buddies of our soldiers, but that's not a country that is equipped to deal with the world's challenges. So I think there's a lot that's gone wrong, and without accountability, we will continue to make mistakes, as history has always taught us. So I would really urge Americans to think hard about this issue, but there should be more questions.
Please come forward with the questions. In the meantime, I'll ask one. Professor Bacevich, I want to press you a little bit on your response to the Cold War nostalgia question. And the response, as I heard it, seems pretty inconsistent with everything else you're saying. I'll tell you why I say that. Listening carefully when you were describing Kennan et al. At the dawn of the Cold War, And you used a phrase that I think was accurate, that what they did was to plan for the assertion of US global supremacy. That's the term you use, I think is accurate. US global supremacy. So isn't that in part where the problems began? That the paradigm of US global supremacy in itself is flawed, and that generation established that paradigm, and we're living with it since then. And one might say, well, we had nuclear war, we had the Soviet threat and so forth, and latter-day global supremacists could make a credible claim that there's still threats out there, and your point about taking care of domestic security, while it's a sound point, is not enough. So why not critique that Cold War generation for inheriting from other nations this global supremacy paradigm that's led us into difficulties?
Well, I think you could. But I think that that would have been asking for one hell of a lot. In that period from 1945, 1949, when really the framework of Cold War US policy was put together, it would have been asking a lot for members of that generation to see beyond the world as that they had grown up in and experienced, and to imagine a radically different world. I mean, they grew up in the world of great power competition that had led to the catastrophe of World War I and the bigger catastrophe of World War II. Now, I know there were voices post-1945 that we would say in retrospect deserve credit for envisioning a different world. Minor hero of mine is Henry Wallace, who, in running as a third party candidate, Progressive Party, in 1948, argued strenuously against the emerging Cold War as something that should organize policy, was roundly defeated and discredited thereafter. Pardon? No, I don't think so. I know he was an Iowan, but I don't think he was a domer. Yeah. But so I am making an excuse for those statesmen. And the excuse says, well, they were products of their time. And given the situation that they inherited, I would say that they did pretty well. Again, I'm not giving them an A, I'm giving them a C+, B-. That they did pretty well in charting a course that served the nation relatively well for the next, 40 years. And my real point is not to be nostalgic or to defend them, but really to say, we face a comparable task today. And to meet that task, we will need a Kennan to emerge who is able to think in broad terms that will bring about a fundamental reorientation of U.S. policy. That's what Kennan's moment in the of fame between the long telegram of February 1946 and his famous Sources of Soviet Conduct essay, summer of 1947. What he was able to formulate a paradigm that prior to 1940 would have been rejected out of hand. So I'm not trying to be nostalgic. What I am trying to say is the task of reformulating a basis for U.S. policy is as pressing today as it was in the immediate wake of World War II. And I mean, there's a lot of sort of academic writing, to include academic writing that comes from this university, that seems to point in useful directions. I hope that the Quincy Institute, which stands for a principle of restraint as a founding basis of foreign policy, I hope we're contributing to that. But at the center of power, you know, who is there? That's where I think we need something that doesn't exist.
We're going to take one more question from here on the floor, and then there's a few that have come in from online, and then conclude. I recognize that the time that was budgeted for this is past. We're supposed to conclude at 1:30, but we're going to take a few extra minutes to finish this discussion. If you must leave, please, you can feel free to do so discreetly.
Okay, so thank you for everyone who spoke today. I had a question for you, Professor Bacevich. So you mentioned in your speech earlier that the US should prioritize real threats and not involve itself in situations that it shouldn't. So I was wondering if you could expand more on like what these real threats may look like. And then additionally, what do you envision the US's role in the world to be, especially as we talk about maybe moving away from American exceptionalism?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the real threats are the ones we read about in the newspaper. You know, the fires out in the Pacific Northwest. My brother's only daughter was married 2 weeks ago in California. My wife and I flew out, a place called Big Bear Lake. There's a national forest there. Just read in the paper yesterday that all the national forests out in that part of the country have been shut down because of existing fires and fire danger. That's a threat to our way of life. That's a threat to our well-being. I know that there is an encouraging amount of talk about the climate crisis. I guess I would argue that talk has not yet translated into effective policy. I mentioned porous borders. You know, there's a criminality problem in Mexico that we would find intolerable. A significant contributing factor to that is the guns that come from the United States through that porous border, the drugs that come the other way, the human trafficking. I would think that that should be viewed as absolutely intolerable. That is a problem that affects the way we live here at home, and it needs to be addressed. I guess in a sense, to try to illustrate the point a little bit more, and I'm not a pacifist. I'm not looking for disarmament. But I want fewer planes going to the United States Air Force and more airplanes going to the United States Forest Service to enhance their capability to fight fires. I'm not against the United States Navy. We got the greatest Navy in the world. I want to see fewer ships in the United States Navy, more ships, cutters, in the United States Coast Guard, which makes it a deeply, I think, unappreciated contribution to our collective well-being in all kinds of ways. So if we recognize that it is no longer the threats out there in the Persian Gulf, in East Asia, that are the greatest, the proximate threats, then that enables us to begin a very substantial shifting of resources so that we are better able to address the threats back here that actually, I think, put in jeopardy the well-being of the American people. Is that okay? Thank you.
I was wondering, Professor Bacevich, if you would consider the fact that major challenges that this country faced were solved by collectivities. The racial question did have a number of individuals who stood for it, but it was also collectivities of people. The gender question, women's role in society, these are still works in progress, but it didn't require single individuals to chart for us the programmatic outcome. So I'm wondering whether we should not be thinking about, and how you think about this question about how do we tap into the strengths and the wisdom of collectivities to take us forward. And on a global scale, our role, what about collective government? In other words, the role of the United Nations. I mean, Americans despise the United Nations, most Americans rather, but when it's to advantage, we utilize it in order to give us the resolutions we want. And on the other hand, we also don't want to sign up to International Criminal Court of Justice. And so, we want to impose a particular order on the world, but we ourselves think that we are an exception to the order. So I wonder what your thinking on that would be.
So I agree on the collectivities issue. But maybe I'm mistaken. But ultimately, that has to translate into political action at the political center. So, I'll take a backseat to no one in my admiration for Martin Luther King and other, proponents, the people who fought for racial equality in our country. That said, at the end of the day, we needed LBJ. We needed LBJ to go persuade or berate or whatever the Congress into passing legislation such as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So at the end of the day, I may be mistaken, but when we need basic change, it has to come about by political action that happens in the political center. I admit I am not a big fan of the United Nations. And I think in part because it seems to me that we are living today with the flaws that were built into the United Nations back in 1945. Where? The Security Council. The idea of a Perm 5, the Perm 5s that may have reflected the distribution of power back in 1945, 1946, doesn't come close to reflecting the distribution of power. But you can't get anything done without the Security Council. I mean, the other day when they passed a resolution that, my words, basically called upon the Taliban to behave. And the People's Republic of China and Russia both abstained. To my mind, that basically gutted. The language itself was weak. It gutted the resolution. Because when two of the Perm 5 say, we ain't interested in this, then it seems to me that the resolution loses persuasive authority. So I wish that the United Nations were a more effective, and I grant its effectiveness on matters related to, health and culture, refugees, unquestionably. But on matters of basic international security, it seems to me that it's been a disappointment. And unless there are structural changes, I don't see how it can live up to the expectations of its founders back in 1945.
Well, the conversation has just begun. This is part one of a three-part series. We have to wind this session down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw out 3 questions that have come in from online. We can't address them, but they'll project to you where the conversation is going, especially with the next event in the series on Pax Americana. And then I'd like each of our panelists, and hopefully if Jamila is still there, to say a quick closing thought, a sentence or two that they can leave us with. So a couple of these questions have come in from our professor, a new faculty member, Mayra Hayat, and she says, how is it possible to separate the gender and race equity question at home with the wars abroad when they're premised on the same idea of inequality, privileging American lives versus non-American lives abroad, or privileging white lives versus non-white lives at home? So aren't these two connected? And then she also says, takes an issue with framing of we've expended and lost this money in Afghanistan when most of it has actually come back home in the pockets of war profiteers. So those are a couple of observations that she's made. You're welcome to respond to that in your closing sentences. And I'll throw in a third one. Should we recognize the Taliban? In any order.
I love those comments and questions. So I thank you to whoever's on Zoom. And I'm going to leave my space to Jamila.
Jamila.
Thank you. To be honest, Taliban are the reality of the ground. We cannot ignore them. And the mistake of ignoring them 20 years back, we can see the result today. So I think instead of ignoring them, it's better to facilitate them, to support them, to establish a comprehensive or cohesive government with meaningful participation of women. We should have learned from the past government that USA had unconditional trust on them. So it should not be the course of time. It should be a check and balance process with Taliban. I think as much we are delaying the recognition of Taliban, it will put humanitarian crisis for 36 million people of Afghanistan. But of course, this government should be monitored closely, and the international community stand with the people of Afghanistan in order to not repeat the mistake of the previous governments.
Thank you, Jamila. Ibrahim.
Thank you.
I think Jamila said it all. And I think we should pay heed to the questions that were asked.
Professor Bacevich, closing thought.
Mine is to agree with Jamila. I mean, we, the United States, lost. We suffered a defeat. Taliban won. That's the new political reality on the ground. We cannot meet our moral responsibility to the Afghan people unless we deal with the new government. That may be difficult, but it seems to me it is absolutely essential. And again, I've talked way too much, but I want to thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this wonderful event.
Please join me in thanking our panel.